Welcome to Voices United, a congregational song podcast. I am your host, Ben Brody, and today my guest is Monique Ingalls. Monique is an ethnomusicologist and assistant professor of music at Baylor University. My interview with Monique took place in January 2019 at Calvin College in Grand Rapids, Michigan. Really grateful to have you here. Welcome, Monique.
It's a pleasure. Thank you.
Could you start by talking about your earliest memories of hymns or congregational singing, and how did your childhood experiences shape your vocation as a scholar of worship and music, as an ethnomusicologist?
Yeah, absolutely. So earliest memories of singing, I grew up in a southern rural congregation, independent Baptist congregation in central Arkansas. And my family were one of the families that was there every time the doors were open, which, at that point was, about 8 days a week, it felt like. But I remember, standing in the pew with my parents. We had these powder blue covered hymnals that we would sing out of, and I remember the singing, being robust. Now my family we were third row Baptists, so I think the robust singing tended to be towards the front. So that probably has shaped my perception a bit. But I remember, so my both of my parents were in the choir. My dad sang in a Southern gospel quartet that performed for offertory about once a month, and so those are all the kind of the childhood hymn and congregational song memories that I have. And then my experiences in church are some of the things that propelled me, towards my vocation and made me interested in the kinds of questions that ethnomusicologists ask. So in junior high, I think it started in seventh grade, I watched my church go through the tensions over musical style and other elements of worship that have become, termed the worship wars. I remember, things at my church changed fairly slowly, but they had changed, fairly completely by the time I was in college. That we had gone from hymnal to screen, for instance. There were still some songs that were accompanied by piano and organ, which was kind of the way that hymns were accompanied when I was growing up. And now there was a contemporary band instead of the choir being the ensemble that undergirded the singing. There was a praise team, on microphones and so on. Anyway, and I remember, from early on in the process, I asked, and I, as a child or as a young teenager, I didn't know whether it was appropriate to ask this or to think this, but I'm just like, why does it have to be an either or? I love these hymns that I've grown up with, these Fanny Crosby, kind of gospel gospel hymnody, 19th century gospel songs, but I also really like and I resonate with this new music as well. So one of the things I would do in high school is when I would be asked to play a piano offertory, I would almost always choose a hymn and a contemporary worship song and put them together, make a medley of them. But those questions, the questions that I asked about music and worship and what musical style means, those ultimately stayed with me, and I wanted to find out more about what caused tensions over musical style, what music means to people, and I discovered the field that I'm now in, ethnomusicology, as a way into answering some of those questions that began in church.
Your training, as you say, is as an ethnomusicologist, and much of your research is focused on contemporary worship, particularly congregational singing. How does your approach to contemporary worship differ from, say, that of a musicologist or a historian?
Yeah, sure. Well, one difference is in the set of methods that I would use. So they tend to center on ethnography, which includes participant observation, interviewing people, firsthand documentation of music in its performance context. And I think that's the big thing that sets ethnomusicology apart, is its idea of music existing in performance. And so, what music means to people and how it affects them is heavily dependent on that performance context. And I think we've all had the experience of singing the exact same song in two different places or at two different times, and it coming across very differently,
Yes.
it bringing up different associations. And so the importance of context, I think, is one of the performance context is one of the things that I think distinguishes ethnomusicology. And I think another difference would be the range of sources that I would use to frame my interpretation. So even though I study mainly North American contemporary worship music, ethnomusicology, the field emphasizes putting our observations and kind of comparing them to what scholars in other parts of the world, working on similar phenomena have found. And so I found valuable ways to interpret what's going on in North American contemporary worship music, from scholars working on Christian communities in India or in Trinidad or in South Africa. It has, sometimes unexpected application for what I'm doing. So I think that use of sources is one thing that distinguishes the approach too. But with that said, I don't want to draw any hard and fast distinctions. I think that ethnography and history and music analysis methods can all contribute to one another. This is a multifaceted phenomenon that we're looking at, and I think ideally, the ideal approach would be to look at congregational song using all of the methods that are in our toolbox.
That's great, and your book helpfully focuses, I think, on differences in how contemporary worship music is performed and experienced, as you say, in different venues. The same song can be experienced very differently in those different settings.
Yeah.
One chapter in your book focuses on the worship concert. Could you briefly describe a worship concert for those who may not have attended one? And how do these concerts, or how have these concerts shaped the expectations of participants for what worship maybe then is like as they go back to their churches?
Yeah, it's a great question. And so a worship concert, I distinguish, and I think it's in that chapter where I distinguish two related repertories of music. So contemporary Christian music, CCM, on the one hand, and then what I'm describing, contemporary worship music on the other. So for a lot of communities use those terms interchangeably. I'm making a distinction here. CCM is something that is performed, by professional artists. That's not meant for primarily for congregational singing. Whereas contemporary worship music, although it is now often performed by celebrity artists, the point of contemporary worship music is to incorporate it into congregational singing. And so it's something that you would sing if you went to a concert setting, where one of these celebrity performers was. You're expected to sing along.
Yes.
It's not a concert where you are listening. It's where all of the words to the songs are on the stage. Everyone is expected to participate by lifting their voice and singing. So that's what differentiates a worship concert from another concert of kind of contemporary Christian music, is that expectation of participation. But it has had wide-ranging effects, the prominence of these worship concerts. And I followed some of the same artists, and I've been to conferences in multiple cities, in Atlanta, I'd pick up this artist in Nashville or Toronto, wherever I happen to be. And it was always instructive to talk to people before and after the concerts to see, why they were there, what the particular songs that they anticipated, hearing, and what the music meant to them, and also to what degree, were these songs that they sang every Sunday in their church, and I found kind of responses kind of all over the map. There were some people that, yes, this was exactly the set of songs, they would, their worship leader would take whatever had come out of this particular artist, and you would hear all the, most of the songs on the album over the, next 6 to 8 months. There was everything from that extreme to the people who said, well, I'm from a smaller church, and, we don't have the resources, to be able to do this music to the quality that we like. So I come here, kind of to get my fix. This is not something we'd sing in church every Sunday, but this is something that this is an important part of my spiritual practice, coming to these concerts and being able to worship in this way. So I think although talking to people and seeing, I saw just how meaningful and impactful this music could be. The other side of things, though, and one that the second kind of person that I referenced has created a set of real difficulties for a lot of smaller churches. That having this music be at the top levels of production, both in its performance at these worship concerts and then in the albums or internet downloads or whatever else that people purchase as a souvenir of this experience. One of the things that that has done is drive up people's expectations of musical quality up to the point that you need a vast amount of resources. But financial, as far as resources of the space, the worship space. Training, what kinds of musicians that you have on hand that can pull off certain styles, and a lot of what this has done for a lot of smaller churches, and this has been documented by folks other than me, is that this has driven people from smaller churches to larger churches that have this worship experience that they've come to expect from the commercial industry, that where it's on offer. It's done that, and then in some smaller congregations, actually someone I met here at this conference at Calvin, who's here this year, I've seen him, he coined a term that I used in my book in that chapter, which was Vivo Church. That came out in conversation. I said, say more about that. What's a Vivo Church? And in his the area where he was from, so I think he lived in the Louisville area and was through various networks knew a lot of smaller church pastors and music ministers and things, and said that a lot of them had felt pressure, that people expected and wanted to sing these songs. And when you have a congregation of 30 to 50 people, and the only people you have, you might have a fifth grade clarinetist in the band and an 85-year-old pianist who can't play these syncopated riffs or whatever else, that they felt like in some ways they felt like the only option for them was to go on the internet, find these. Vivo is a commercial, is a platform that a lot of the contemporary music artists use to do these to do official YouTube renditions of their songs, and so they would get on YouTube and just play the song and have people as kind of in some ways a worship karaoke track, if you will, and have people sing along with it. And so I think that that the music and that is not certainly may not be the intention of its creators, but that is one effect that that contemporary worship music, that the worship concert and the whole kind of commercial industry products have had on congregational music making.
It seems to me in some ways that's almost parallel to the experience that maybe even goes back some decades earlier, of the sort of summer camp experience of you go to summer camp, you learn all these new songs, you're with all this group of your peers, you have this kind of this spiritual high, and then you come back to your church and you want to replicate that, and it's difficult or impossible.
Absolutely, and one of the I think one of the most helpful metaphors or ways to describe that, and what I do in the second chapter of the book, is it's a pilgrimage. People are taking, and summer camp can be viewed that exact same way. You go somewhere to get an experience that's outside, that's transcendent, that's outside of your more mundane kind of church going life, and in pilgrimages of all kinds, all over the world. People take back souvenirs that link them to that experience, and now we have a whole range of musical souvenirs that people want to take back, and they want to replicate that same experience that they've had. And I've seen that over and over again in interviews with people. When I'm talking about specific songs, I did interviews with one of the most interesting, I think, set of people people that I interviewed were worship video creators who had taken these particular, commercially popular worship songs, just the recordings of them, and put a range of images or scriptural text or sometimes the lyrics of the songs, a combination of those things, and then had stuck them up on YouTube. Okay. I was curious about this practice because they're everywhere. Yeah. Curious about the intentions of and the motivations of some of the people doing that. And one of the things that always came up for people were the original context that they heard the songs. And so often it was worship concerts, it was these out of the ordinary experiences that people were referencing. One person said, I was actually, for this song I was singing on that recording, I was part of the the gathering of 10,000 or 15,000 college students that were there when they made the live recording of that song.
Wow. I take students every other year to Taizé for a week. Ooh. And that, I think there are some similarities there as I talk now to alums that did that 6 or 8 years ago. Very much a connection of that particular place being important and a desire to sort of return to that experience that they had, much earlier. So that's great. How has the role of contemporary music in worship changed over the past 50 years?
Yeah. Well, I think, maybe first and most obviously, many more churches employ it. So, and there are others. Lester Ruth is a liturgical historian. That's he and Sui Hong Lim are in a smaller book and now in a more extensive treatment are tracing some of these lines. But 50 years ago, this music was pretty much the province of charismatic churches. 30 to 35 years ago, in the 80s, you start seeing more of it come into non-charismatic evangelical churches. A few years later, mainline and Catholic congregations. Well, say Catholic charismatic congregations had it since the beginning, but more mainline Protestant and Catholic congregations started to kind of have to reckon with it as well, whether they were going to adopt it wholesale or adapt it or reject it. So I remember I came across I think it was an issue of Reformed Worship from, I want to say 1991 or 1992, that the whole issue was on contemporary worship, and it's just like the issue you thought you'd never see, I think, was the way that it was billed. So it's made its way across denominations and of course across the world as well. So that's focusing on the U.S. context, but you had the rise of mega brands. I mean, for lack of a better term, you had the rise of these brands like Hillsong, Passion, a little later Bethel, that arose out of particular ministries or out of very well resourced churches that started to that had these wide distribution networks, a lot of which were based on either denomination or kind of these charismatic church networks that could reach and permeate many other areas of the world. So now you have in the last 10 years or so, I mean, I know a number of scholars who have focused on Hillsong, say in South Africa and Scandinavia and the Netherlands parts of Asia. I mean, it has become a global phenomenon, and arguably has been a global phenomenon for longer than just the movements in the 80s and 90s that I was mentioning. But one of the things that it has brought with it, I think, another way, a way that contemporary worship music has changed what churches do, is that in a lot of cases it's brought with it a change in liturgical structure.
Yes.
So where you had a lot of my students, for instance, at Baylor. So I grew up Baptist, independent Baptist, and I remember the structure of Baptist worship that I grew up with was very much the song, announcements, song, kind of the you'd have a lot of singing at the beginning, the preaching, the altar call, and then a closing song. So singing was sort of split, and you would sing several songs over the course of the sermon with things interspersed. Yeah. The charismatic model has has a long song set, a long and generally uninterrupted song set that can last anywhere from 15 minutes to, depending on your context. I mean, typically not over 45, but there are sometimes it can go on for an hour and a half or 2 hours. But and then so you have this kind of bifurcated structure where you have song and then this participatory element and then the sermon and then sometimes a time of ministry after that. So many of my students who have grown up in Baptist backgrounds are more familiar with that, with the song, with that liturgical structure than they were the kind of older Baptist model. So you can see the ways that the charismatic praise and worship structure has influenced churches far beyond those networks.
That's great. I wanted to. There's a chapter in your book where you reflect on observations you made at two conferences at which worship and music play a pretty significant role. And in both of those, there were you reflected on how this North American kind of evangelical culture engaged with some other cultures around the world.
Yeah.
I wonder if you would, as we see more and more North American evangelical churches seeking, it seems, to engage beyond maybe their own culture, or the dominant culture in their area, what advice or what cautions would you have for them?
Yeah. And so based on my observations in that chapter, just to give a little bit more background there, I went to two conferences twice, so six years apart, so that I would have, more than one full experience of each. One was the Passion Conference, which then was in Atlanta. It's now simulcast in multiple locations, and the other was the triennial Urbana student conference. The first year that I went, both conferences were comparable in size. I think they had between 16 and 18,000 students each. 6 years later, Urbana was about that size, and Passion had ballooned to over 60,000.
Wow.
We were meeting in the Georgia Dome at that point, and so. So one of the strongest contrasts, I think, in what happens at those conferences is found in the music, and one of the things that I detail in that chapter is how intentional Urbana, in particular, was in choosing a worship team that had representatives of students from a variety of different racial and ethnic backgrounds, as well as a good number of men and women who shared leadership roles. I think that was one of the biggest things. There was a main worship leader who was kind of responsible for the whole, but they would take turns. Leading the songs, and they would incorporate, as the conference went on. I mean, they did a variety of music that was, again, very carefully chosen. They started out with, typically towards the beginning of the conference, there would be a lot of familiar contemporary worship songs, some black gospel, as well, that a lot of the students would know, and then they sort of slowly over the course of the week segued into more unfamiliar material, so singing songs in other languages, typically languages that they knew. Many of the attendees would be singing, sure. And they also experimented, with different musical styles, bringing in different instruments, and kind of going beyond either the pop rock or the contemporary gospel sound that tends to predominate in the music. So, and one of the things that did, in talking to both the leaders, and the students there, is that it promoted a sense of, both of belonging among students with backgrounds that didn't typically feel maybe like they belonged in these predominantly white pop rock oriented contemporary worship services, but for a lot of students it also really broadened their understanding of what musical worship could be, and the potential range of sounds and leadership styles that could be involved. So I found that to be quite a contrast to the, perhaps less intentional model that Passion gave. And I know that one thing that I would say to nuance this is that I think that that the organizers of Passion have realized some of these things over time. When I look at their lineup, say for the conference this year, I notice a lot more leadership of particularly people of color. I'm not sure if there are more women in leadership or not, but the years that I went, it was pretty predominantly the straight ahead pop rock style. There are 6 or 7 men who all look mostly alike, the 20 or 30 something year old men in skinny jeans, and the question of what that communicates to an audience from across backgrounds. I mean, certainly what it communicates to young women, when there's often a woman on stage, but she's almost always the background singer, and maybe gets a song per set that she leads. I think that these decisions about who leads in particular send messages, and I think that it can be done. The message can be intentional. I think, as in the case of Urbana, where a lot of thought has gone into this, but I think that we need to. That's a caution for people doing. For people trying to do multi-ethnic ministry, or regardless of, or even ministry to people across ages or ability levels, is the question of not just who is participating in the pews, but who's leading on stage, and what's the relationship between the leaders? Is there a mutuality, or is there just someone up there for, I think, as Gerardo Marti calls it, visual diversity?
You've maybe touched on part of the answer to this next question, but actually let me ask it in the positive first. What today do you find most encouraging to you in the landscape of congregational singing and worship?
Yeah, and I thought about how to put this, and the phrase that kept coming back to me was the new contextualism. So, and what I mean by that is, I think, and I've seen this in my students of kind of from 18 to 30, like that age group right now, is that there's a real emphasis on wanting to move away from one-size-fits-all approaches and taking seriously the role of the music director or the worship leader in thoughtfully curating the materials that are out there, not sticking to, either the what's in the contents of this hymnal or what's on the CCLI top 100, but really being exposed to a variety of resources and then choosing wisely among those for a particular set of people that are gathering at a particular time that have a particular set of concerns. And so I think that in some ways it's exciting, it's challenging, it can be overwhelming, and that's why I'm glad to see conferences like the one that we're attending right now, the Calvin conference, that really that serve as resources for people who are trying to minister to complex, unique local contexts, who are both trying to because we want songs that both link us to what's going on in Christianity more broadly. We want songs that can link us to our brothers and sisters across the world, our brothers and sisters who have come ahead of us in time, but that also again speak into these very particular local situations and that jive at least somewhat with the peculiar preferences that our congregations may have.
That's helpful. I've observed that as well. I think with my students, less of a resistance maybe than in the past to drawing from more eclectic sources and crafting services that are that are responsive to that particular community. What today most concerns you about congregational singing and worship?
I think going back to an earlier strand of our discussion. I think one of the things that concerns me, especially in our, in North America and in many other parts of the world, our very politically charged climate, how congregational music is becoming, perhaps a renewed source of division between people of different backgrounds, how certain musical styles are coming to stand in for, say, ideological positions. And in some ways, and sometimes there are good reasons that they've come to do that, when there are certain styles, like the pop rock style that I mentioned earlier, that has tended to be very white male dominated. There are certain associations that come along with that, and music, congregational music, that could be simply a one among many resources that people draw from, instead takes on these resonances and then becomes even more a source of a symbol of difference and division.
This is our music that represents us.
Absolutely, or even worse, kind of the or this is the music of the global church. This is what everyone is singing, and if you want to feel like you're participating, you need to learn this musical style. You need to maybe we'll translate it into your language, maybe not. Maybe you can just sing it in English, but absolutely.
What advice would you give to someone just beginning their vocation as a worship leader?
So there's obviously advice books, plethoras of good advice to give. I think just a couple of points. One is that someone starting out in their vocation as a worship leader, it's overwhelming. You step into a church situation, there are so many different skills, musical, pastoral, administrative, that you're expected to have or that you're going to have to grow into, at the time. And so I think the setting aside time to read and reflect in the middle of what can be just an overwhelming time, where you might have the tendency to just want to go and to do and to not seriously reflect on what you're doing. I think that's one thing that I'd say. I mean, even if it's just an hour a week to sit down with your thoughts, maybe glean a different perspective on something. I mean, as I mentioned, there are no shortage of resources out there to help you in any one of these ways. So continuing to set aside time to read and reflect. And then another piece of advice, and this was something that very early on in my research and ministry, those have always kind of been interconnected and intertwined for me. A music minister with a great deal of administrative skill and experience said, write down everything your church sings. Just write it down. Take the time and have the discipline to, after every service, or sometime that week, to write down what your church sings, because your own perception of even as the person who chooses the music may be very different from empirical reality, if you will. And that's one of the things that I have my students, one part of their ethnographic project that they do. I teach a class called Song of the Church, and every semester they're required to do ethnographic participant observation and interviewing and documentation of their church's music culture. And one of the things that they enjoy most, they don't think they're going to enjoy it, but they end up getting a lot out of it, is chronicling 8 or 9 weeks of what the church sings, and then kind of comparing that or contrasting that to the perception either of the music leadership or of some of the congregation. So I had one student this semester who kind of based her final paper around this observation that music at her church, and it was a kind of contemporary worship music singing church, was very that they repeated the same songs all the time. She got that from people, that I just wish we could sing some different songs, and she kept up with them for 8 weeks. She found that there was only one song that was repeated. Wow. So she goes into some of the dynamics of what was it that made people think that? Was it homogeneity of style? Was it certain messages that they were getting about about the style, from other sources. So I think, writing down everything that you sing so that you can analyze it later, so that you can, of course, think into the future in building. I know Constance Cherry talks a lot about this, building your church's song canon. One of the things that's necessary for that is knowing what you have sung, what you currently sing, and then making a vision for kind of where you want to be in the next few years.
Oh, that's good. Thank you. Well, Monique, I'd like to finish with 5 questions that I ask to close each interview with. The first is, which hymn or song has most shaped your faith?
I thought about this, and I came up with a short list of 4 or 5 songs, and then from there I ended up selecting this song, the contemporary worship song, "Did You Feel the Mountains Tremble?" So this was a song, mid-90s, Delirious. It was a British band. I didn't know that. I found out who had composed and popularized it only later. I heard it at a church youth camp when I was probably 15 or 16, say to date me there. But most worship songs at that time were what people described as vertical. It was about the relationship between the individual and God, very much focused on intimacy. And this song, I remember being so different from that, because into that milieu, enter a song with the words, do you feel the darkness tremble when all the saints join in one song and all the streams flow as one river to wash away our brokenness. I just remember, I still get chills, when I think about those lines. And to me, as a young teenager, that song introduced me in some ways to the idea of worship and justice meeting. And it expresses so powerfully, I think, God having the power to heal the church, to heal division, to bring justice into the world. And it's fun to sing and play too. So I still enjoy it. I know it's ancient, by contemporary worship standards, but still a favorite.
No, it's a catchy melody and rhythmically interesting, and that's great. What hymn or song do you turn to for comfort?
So a couple of these. One of them that's been a favorite of mine ever. Growing up in church, Leaning on the Everlasting Arms. The Showalter and Hoffman. And in fact, that's what comes to mind. That's been a lullaby, that I've sung to my girls. It's a favorite for playing offertory, and so on. I think that it's one of the most that idea, just the image, leaning on the everlasting arms is profoundly comforting. And another more recent hymn that I've found that I turn to sometimes is Elizabeth Smith's "God in the Darkness." And it's a beautiful text, and I would say it's I encountered the text. Where did I encounter the text? I think somebody that was in a music ministry that I was in brought it up, and I had never heard the song before. And it was in a hymnal. I think the hymn writer, I think she's from New Zealand. Possibly say, don't quote me on that, New Zealand or Australia. And it was in. It was only much later that I actually found the musical setting, but I found the words so affecting. So God in the darkness. God beyond our knowing, patient creator, seed in secret growing, rock of living, blood and water flowing, come and renew us. So that's anyway. I found it so captivating that I wrote my own tune to it, since I didn't, I just had the words, and so I must admit it's her words and my tune, that I come to when I sing it. But it's one of the rare hymns, I think, that acknowledges and lets the singer really, in some ways, sit in the darkness. So often we want to skip from, there's darkness, but here's the light. Jesus came, but sitting in that place of uncertainty, and I think that it's a fantastic hymn for that.
I'll look forward to looking that up and discovering that. What is your favorite piece of music?
Yeah, this was so hard, and I almost didn't provide a response here, but I looked up on iTunes. I was like, okay, so if I were to take as my most favorite piece of music what I've listened to the most, the answer surprised me in a way. So there were two that kind of came up to the top, and both instrumental works. So Miles Davis's "Kind of Blue." Apparently, I've played that an awful lot over the course of my iTunes listening, and then there is a favorite CD that I found as a graduate student. I think I probably burned the library's copy, so it's probably on my laptop illegally. But it is it's a CD of kora music from Mali. I love the sound of the kora. Is this bridge harp, and these kora players they play. There are three different layers. It sounds like there are two or three instrumentalists playing when it's actually only one person. But it's in cyclic form, and so you listen for the variations that take place over this over this kind of ground bass, and so that was the other thing that came up. The name of the recording was Balake from Musa Sissoko.
Oh, what a wonderful diverse mix of pieces there that you've gotten your listening now. What book other than the Bible has most shaped your faith or influenced your vocation?
And this is such a Sunday school answer for hymnologists, right? The hymnal.
The hymnal.
No, the hymnal that I grew up with. I mean, I again gave some serious thought to this, and I thought, no, I can think of. I do think that this hymnal I grew up with, it was the 1979 Praise Our Songs and Hymns, compiled by John W. Peterson and Norman Johnson. Those powder blue covers. And when I was my parents bought me a pianist's hymnal for Christmas when I was probably 8 or 9, and that hymnal. I mean, I took it to my piano lessons. It was something that I learned to improvise. In kind of the Baptist hymn improvising style. I learned how to arrange, so it was important for my musical development. But I think one of the things it did too was it exposed me to a greater variety of songs than than my church ever sang. There were all those songs, when I would, sit down with the hymnal, and find something new. I found Let All Mortal Flesh Keep Silence, All Creatures of Our God and King. So many of these songs that, my Baptist church tended to focus on kind of the gospel hymn era, but just realizing and hearing the very different sounds, even if they were all, still arranged in 4-part harmony, and different ideas, really that had come from these different segments of the church. I think that hymnal broadened my idea of what Christian music was, and what we could use in church.
Yeah, that's great. That's great. What hymn would you like to have sung at your funeral?
Yeah, Leaning on the Everlasting Arms. Yeah, without a doubt.
Well, Monique, it's been such a joy to get to spend this time with you. Thank you so much.
Thank you. I really appreciate your time and what you're doing here.
And I want to encourage listeners who are interested in these topics we've discussed to pick up your recent book, Singing the Congregation: How Contemporary Worship Music Forms Evangelical Community, published by Oxford University Press. Thank you.
Thank you.
Voices United, a congregational song podcast, is produced by Benjamin Brody, with support from the Hymn Society in the United States and Canada and Whitworth University. Special thanks to the Center for Congregational Song for publicity and technical expertise, and Whitworth University alum Lane King for editing and production.